Jason stood in the courtroom holding up a spreadsheet. "The funds didn't disappear," he said. "They were funneled into an offshore account, tied to Richard Blake Investments." The room gasped. Blake's face went pale. Jason's eyes narrowed. "You framed my father." The judge's gavel slammed down. But what happened next shocked everyone. Jason Carter sat at the defendant's table, his small frame nearly swallowed by the massive leather chair. His feet dangled a few inches off the ground, and the sleeves of his navy blue suit jacket were a size too big, hanging awkwardly over his thin wrists. He was clutching a worn brown folder, his knuckles white from the tension. The courtroom was cold, both literally and figuratively. The air conditioning hummed overhead, and the heavy marble walls made the room feel more like a tomb than a place where justice was served. Jason's father, Michael Carter, sat beside him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He wore a rumpled gray suit, a sharp contrast to the immaculate attire of the opposing counsel, Richard Blake. Michael's hands were folded tightly in his lap, his wedding ring glinting faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. He glanced down at his son, the worry in his eyes unmistakable. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious spectators, and legal professionals lined the pews, whispering amongst themselves. After all, how often does a 10-year-old boy represent his father in a high-stakes embezzlement case? The buzz of low voices created an undercurrent of tension that pressed down on Jason's small shoulders. Judge Harris, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, sat behind a high mahogany bench. His expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his sharp blue eyes as he looked down at the young boy in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harris said, addressing Jason directly, "do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yes, Your Honor." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jason could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment, the disbelief. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, but he didn't look away from the judge. His father's life was on the line. He couldn't afford to be scared. Richard Blake, the opposing counsel, stood and straightened his expensive Italian suit. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair slicked back to perfection. His smile was razor-sharp and completely devoid of warmth. He strolled toward the jury box with a predatory grace, like a shark circling its prey. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Blake said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I'm not entirely sure what we're doing here." He gestured toward Jason with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is a financial fraud case involving millions of dollars. And yet, the defense has decided to be represented by an elementary school student?" Quiet laughter rippled through the gallery. Jason's cheeks burned. He lowered his eyes to the table, feeling the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. Blake smiled wider. "I mean, I can't blame Mr. Carter for the strategy. It's a smart move. Who would want to prosecute a kid? But let's be real. This is not a playground. This is a courtroom." Jason's hands tightened around the folder. He could feel the thin paper crumpling beneath his fingers. Judge Harris's gaze hardened. "Mr. Blake, the court does not discriminate based on age. Jason Carter has been granted permission to represent his father, and unless you wish to challenge that decision, I suggest you focus on your case." Blake held up his hands in mock surrender. "Of course, Your Honor. No disrespect intended." Jason's eyes narrowed as Blake turned and walked back toward his table, clearly satisfied with himself. Jason's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what Blake was doing, trying to get inside his head, trying to intimidate him. Judge Harris turned toward Jason. "Mr. Carter, are you prepared to proceed?" Jason hesitated for the briefest of moments. His father reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "You can do this, Jason. Michael whispered. His voice was rough, broken. Jason straightened his back. Yes, Your Honor. Blake smirked. This should be good. Jason's eyes flashed toward him, and something inside him hardened. Blake had already made one mistake. Underestimating him, Jason wasn't just here to defend his father. He was here to win. Jason stood, clutching his folder tightly. His legs felt shaky beneath him, but he forced himself to walk toward the witness stand with slow, deliberate steps. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, the reporters scribbling notes, the jurors watching with thinly veiled skepticism.
Jason climbed onto the wooden platform and stood behind the podium. His small hands barely reached the microphone. The bailiff adjusted it for him, and Jason nodded gratefully. He took a deep breath and opened the folder. "Members of the jury," Jason began, his voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "My father has been accused of stealing $3 million from Hamilton Financial. But the truth is, he didn't steal anything." Blake scoffed loudly. "Objection. Speculation." Judge Harris's gaze darkened. "Overruled. Let him speak." Jason's heart thudded in his chest. He flipped to the next page in the folder. "I know I'm just a kid, and I know most of you don't think I belong here. But I've spent the last 6 months reviewing every piece of evidence in this case." His eyes sharpened as he lifted the document. "And I found something the prosecution overlooked." Blake's smile thinned. Jason lifted the sheet of paper. "This is the transaction record from my father's account, but this..." He pulled out another paper. "This is the internal ledger from Hamilton Financial." He held them side by side. "The two don't match." Blake's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Jason met his gaze head-on. "I'm suggesting that someone altered the records." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Blake's mouth twisted, but Jason saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. "That's a very serious accusation," Blake said smoothly. "Do you have any proof?" Jason's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Not yet," he said softly, "but I will." Blake's smile faded. Judge Harris watched Jason carefully. His expression had shifted. The amusement was gone, replaced by something far more serious. Jason stepped back from the podium and returned to his seat. His hands were shaking, but he sat tall, his eyes fixed on the prosecution's table. Blake's smile was gone entirely now. He leaned toward his co-counsel and whispered something. Jason couldn't hear it, but he could see the tension in Blake's jawline. For the first time since the trial began, Blake looked worried. Michael leaned toward his son, his eyes wide with amazement. "Jason, how did you find that?" Jason's eyes stayed locked on Blake. "I didn't sleep." Michael smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He brushed Jason's hair back from his forehead. "You're incredible," he whispered. Jason's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. He wanted to savor the moment, the brief flicker of pride in his father's eyes, but he knew the hard part was still ahead. He had made a crack in Blake's defense. Now he just had to tear it open.
Jason sat quietly at the defense table, his small hands resting on the edge of the polished oak surface. His father, Michael Carter, sat beside him, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn from exhaustion. Michael's brown eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and faint stubble shadowed his jawline, the signs of a man who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for far too long. Jason could feel the tension in his father's body, the barely concealed tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted anxiously around the room. He was a man trying to hold himself together for the sake of his son, but the cracks were beginning to show. Jason knew his father better than anyone, and he knew that Michael Carter wasn't a criminal. Jason's mind drifted back to the day his father was arrested. It had been a Saturday morning. Jason was sitting at the kitchen table, eating cereal and working on his math homework, when the loud knock at the door startled him. He had watched in horror as two officers in dark suits entered their house, handcuffed his father, and escorted him out in front of the entire neighborhood. His father hadn't resisted. He had just looked down at Jason and said, "It's going to be okay." But it hadn't been okay. Michael Carter was being accused of embezzling over $3 million from Hamilton Financial, the company he had worked at for over 15 years. Jason had spent those first few days after the arrest lying awake at night, listening to the sound of his father pacing in the next room. The silence was heavier than any noise. Jason had begged his father to explain what was happening, but Michael's response had been quiet and heavy. "I don't know." Jason had felt the fear settle into his bones. His father always knew what to do. His father always had the answers, but not this time. When the trial date was set, Jason overheard his father talking to a lawyer over the phone. The lawyer had said that the case was hopeless, that the paper trail was too strong. Jason had seen the defeat in his father's eyes when he hung up the phone. Michael had sat at the kitchen table for a long time, head in his hands. Jason had stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, and then Jason had said it. "I'll defend you." Michael had lifted his head slowly. "Jason, that's not possible." Jason had crossed the room, determination in his eyes. "Dad, you always tell me to stand up for the truth. Let me stand up for you." Michael had smiled sadly. "Jason, you're just a kid." "I'm your kid," Jason had said, "and I'm not going to let them do this to you." After that, Jason had thrown himself into the case. He stayed up late at night, reading through financial documents, legal papers, and trial transcripts. He pored over Hamilton Financial's transaction records until his eyes blurred from exhaustion. He researched embezzlement cases online, memorized courtroom procedures, and read everything he could about corporate law. Michael had tried to talk him out of it, but Jason wouldn't listen. He knew his father was innocent, and he was going to prove it. Now, sitting in that courtroom, Jason could feel the doubt in the room. He could hear the whispers from the gallery, the soft chuckles from the reporters, the skepticism etched on the faces of the jury. Jason tightened his grip on the folder in front of him. His father's freedom depended on him, and he couldn't afford to let him down. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harris's voice cut through the tension, "you may proceed." Jason stood and walked toward the podium. He set down his papers and adjusted the microphone, which was too tall for him even after the bailiff had lowered it. He reached up on his tiptoes and cleared his throat. "My father has been accused of embezzlement," Jason began. His voice trembled slightly at first, but then he steadied himself. "But the evidence doesn't add up." Richard Blake, the prosecutor, stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his mouth curved into a mocking smile. Jason turned toward the jury. "My dad is a good man. He's worked at Hamilton Financial for over 15 years. He's the kind of person who brings coffee to the office every morning and remembers everyone's birthdays. He works hard. He's never even gotten a parking ticket." Blake scoffed loudly. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Harris's gaze darkened. "Overruled." Jason's eyes flashed toward Blake. "You want relevance?" He pulled out 2 sheets of paper and held them up. "This is the transaction record from my father's account, and this is the internal ledger from Hamilton Financial." He set them side by side on the evidence table. "The numbers don't match." Blake frowned. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Carter?" Jason stepped toward the jury. "I'm suggesting that someone altered the records." Blake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And how exactly would a child know that?" Jason's chest tightened, but he forced himself to hold his ground. "Because I looked closer than you did." Blake's smile thinned. Jason could see the flicker of discomfort beneath the man's polished facade. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the papers. Someone transferred money out of my father's account and into a shell company, but the company doesn't exist. It's a front. Blake's mouth twitched. Jason took another step toward the jury. Do you know where the money ended up? Blake's jaw tightened. Jason flipped to the next page in his folder and held it up. An offshore account. Blake's face went pale. Jason's voice sharpened. And that offshore account is registered under Blake Investments. A gasp spread through the courtroom. Michael's eyes widened. Blake's hands clenched into fists. Judge Harris's eyes narrowed. Mr. Blake, is this true? Blake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jason stepped back toward his father and set his hand on Michael's arm. His father was staring at him in disbelief. Jason, Michael whispered. How did you find that? Jason's voice softened. Because I know you. You would never steal from anyone. Michael's eyes filled with tears. He reached over and brushed his hand through Jason's hair. I don't know how you... Jason gave a small smile. I've been studying. Blake took a shaky breath. Your Honor, this is absurd. Sit down, Mr. Blake, Judge Harris said coldly. Blake's face flushed deep red as he sank into his chair. Jason could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He had exposed the truth, but it wasn't over yet. Michael leaned toward him. Jason, you don't have to do this anymore. You've already done enough. Jason shook his head. His hands were still shaking, but his voice was steady. No, it's not over yet. He glanced toward Blake, whose face was still pale. Jason's heart hammered as he realized, for the first time, that the prosecutor was scared. And Jason was just getting started. Jason stood at the podium, his small hands gripping the edge as he stared down Richard Blake with a quiet intensity that seemed almost unnatural for a boy his age. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the occasional shuffle of paper from the stenographer's desk. Blake's face was frozen in a half-smile, his mouth slightly open as if he was about to speak but couldn't quite find the words. Jason, despite his small size and thin frame, radiated an unsettling sense of confidence, the kind that belonged to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Jason's hand trembled as he lifted the paper. This offshore account, he repeated, his voice steady and sharp, is registered under Blake Investments. Gasps erupted through the courtroom. A reporter in the front row actually dropped her pen. The jury's collective gaze snapped toward Blake, their expressions shifting from mild boredom to sharp interest. Even Judge Harris, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout most of the trial, leaned forward in his chair. Blake's face turned pale. He opened his mouth, but Jason cut him off. Mr. Blake, Jason said, his voice low and cold. Do you have an explanation for this? Blake forced a tight smile. This is absurd. Jason held up the document. Actually, it's very real. He flipped to the next page and pointed to a line highlighted in yellow. This is the routing number for the transfer. It matches the account tied to Blake Investments. Blake's smile faltered. You don't seriously expect this court to believe... Jason took a step forward, cutting off Blake's words mid-sentence. The trail is clear. The money was moved in small increments over a period of 8 months, just enough to avoid triggering the bank's internal fraud detection system. That's why it took so long to notice. Judge Harris's brow furrowed. Mr. Blake, is this true? Blake's lips parted, but his voice caught. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Jason saw the tension in his jawline, the way his nostrils flared as he fought to control his breathing. Jason turned toward the jury. If this had been a simple accounting error, the funds would have shown up in the company's internal audit, but they didn't. That's because they weren't stolen from Hamilton Financial. He flipped another page. They were laundered. Blake's face twisted. Enough. His voice sharpened. This is ridiculous. This child. Jason's eyes narrowed. This child just caught you. A low rumble spread through the courtroom. Jason could feel the energy shift. It was no longer just amusement at a precocious child trying to play lawyer. Now it was respect. Jason walked toward the evidence table, his steps measured and deliberate. He reached into his folder and pulled out another sheet of paper. This is a sworn affidavit from Martin Keegan, the former head of accounting at Hamilton Financial. Blake's eyes darkened. Keegan was fired. Yes, Jason said, holding the paper higher. After he discovered the discrepancy, he filed a report with the board of directors, but it was buried. Judge Harris leaned forward. And why was it buried? Jason's lips curled into a thin smile. Because Blake is on the board of directors. The room exploded. Reporters scrambled to take notes, and flashes of cameras went off in the gallery. Blake's face turned red as he shot to his feet. Objection, Blake barked. None of this has been authenticated. Jason held up a small envelope. Actually, it has. Blake's mouth snapped shut. Jason walked toward the bailiff and handed him the envelope. This contains copies of the original financial records and email correspondence between Blake and the board of directors. Blake's mouth twisted into a snarl. Where did you get that? Jason's gaze sharpened. You left a trail. Blake's hands curled into tight fists at his sides. This is outrageous. These are confidential documents. Jason's eyes narrowed. Exactly. Judge Harris opened the envelope and examined the papers. His expression darkened. These records are authentic. Blake's composure began to crack. He's a child. Jason's gaze didn't waver. And yet, I outsmarted you. A ripple of quiet admiration spread through the gallery. A woman in the jury box smiled faintly. One of the court officers in the back actually nodded. Jason took a step back, his hands steady despite the way his pulse hammered in his ears. His heart was racing so fast it felt like it might tear through his chest. But he couldn't let them see that. He had to stay in control. Blake leaned over the table toward Jason, his eyes hard and dangerous. This isn't over. Jason smiled thinly. Yes, it is. Judge Harris's gavel slammed down. This court will recess while this evidence is examined. He turned toward Blake. And, Mr. Blake, I would advise you to prepare a very good explanation. Blake's face was flushed with rage as he sank back into his chair. Jason saw the tension in his shoulders, the hard set of his jawline. But for the first time, Jason wasn't scared. Michael leaned toward his son, his voice low and filled with awe. Jason, how did you figure all of this out? Jason smiled faintly. I paid attention. Michael's eyes filled with tears. He reached over and squeezed Jason's hand tightly. I'm so proud of you. Jason squeezed back. I told you, Dad. I wasn't going to let them win. Michael shook his head in disbelief. Jason, you're incredible. Jason's heart squeezed. He wasn't used to hearing that. His father had always been supportive. But this was different. This was more than pride. This was respect. Jason glanced toward Blake, whose face was still pale. Blake's hands trembled slightly as he leaned toward his co-counsel, whispering something. Jason couldn't hear it, but he could see the fear in Blake's eyes. Blake was scared. Jason stepped back from the podium, his hands at his sides. He had just done the impossible. He had exposed the truth. But it wasn't over yet. Judge Harris stood and began gathering his papers. Court will resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. Jason felt Michael's hand on his shoulder as they stood to leave. Michael's smile was shaky, but it was real. "You're amazing," Michael whispered. Jason gave him a small smile. "I know." As they walked toward the exit, Jason felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom following him. The quiet admiration, the disbelief, the growing respect. Blake sat at his table, his face pale and drawn. Jason glanced toward him one last time and smiled faintly. This wasn't over. Not yet. Jason sat at the defense table, his small hands resting on the polished wood surface. His father, Michael Carter, sat beside him, his hands clasped tightly together. There was a quiet tension in the room, the kind that settles just before a storm breaks. Judge Harris's gavel had just slammed down, and the echo of it was still ringing in Jason's ears. Richard Blake sat across the room at the prosecution's table, his face pale, his jaw tight. His usually perfect hair was slightly out of place, a single dark strand falling across his forehead. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and his eyes were narrowed as he stared down at the papers in front of him. Jason had done it. He had exposed Blake. He had ripped open the heart of the prosecution's case and laid bare the truth. Blake had framed his father to cover up his own financial crimes. And now the whole courtroom knew it. Blake's hands were shaking. His carefully polished composure had cracked, and Jason had been the one to break it. Judge Harris sat back in his chair, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Mr. Blake," the judge said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "do you have an explanation for the evidence presented by the defense?" Blake's mouth opened and closed. He looked toward his co-counsel, a thin man with glasses who had gone ghost white. No help there. Blake's eyes darted toward the gallery, toward the line of reporters, the flashing cameras, the expectant faces of the jury. "Your Honor," Blake said, forcing his voice into something close to steadiness. "This is an outrageous—" Jason's voice cut through him like ice. "The evidence is real." Blake's head snapped toward him. "You're a child." Jason's gaze was cold. "And you underestimated me." Michael squeezed his son's shoulder, his hand trembling slightly. Jason glanced toward his father and saw something in his eyes that nearly stole his breath. Pride. Real, unmistakable pride. His father wasn't just amazed. He was proud. Blake straightened his shoulders. This is a misunderstanding. There is no proof that I—" Jason flipped to the next page in his folder and held it up. "This is a wire transfer receipt. It shows that the funds from Hamilton Financial were rerouted to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands." Jason's eyes sharpened. "And the account is registered under Blake Investments." Blake's face drained of color. "That's circumstantial." Jason stepped toward the podium. His voice was sharp and steady. "It's a paper trail." He flipped to another document. "And here is an email exchange between Blake and the board of directors at Hamilton Financial. It clearly states that Keegan's original report was dismissed under Blake's direction." Blake's eyes widened. He stood so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "That's enough." Jason's eyes narrowed. "No, it's not." Blake's face twisted in anger. He jabbed a finger toward Jason. "He's lying. This is fabricated evidence." Judge Harris's gavel slammed down. "Mr. Blake, sit down." Blake's mouth twisted into a furious snarl. He turned toward his co-counsel, who was now visibly sweating. Blake's hands curled into fists at his sides. Jason stepped toward the judge's bench. His small figure seemed almost fragile under the heavy shadows of the courtroom, but his voice was anything but weak. "Your Honor, I request that the prosecution's case be dismissed based on the fraudulent nature of the evidence presented by the state." Judge Harris's gaze sharpened. "On what grounds?" Jason held up the final document. the one he had saved for last. "This is a sworn statement from Martin Keegan. He testified that Blake instructed him to falsify the financial records in order to cover up the missing funds." Judge Harris's eyes darkened. "Mr. Blake?" Blake's face turned a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands trembled at his sides. Jason's eyes stayed locked on him. "You tried to destroy my father to cover up your own crimes. You thought no one would figure it out." Blake took a shaky step back. This is ridiculous." Jason's voice sharpened. "No. What's ridiculous is that you thought a child couldn't figure it out." Judge Harris's gavel slammed down again. "Mr. Blake, you are hereby removed from this case pending a formal investigation." He turned toward the court officers. "Escort Mr. Blake out of the courtroom." Blake's eyes widened in horror. "You can't!" Two court officers stepped toward him. Blake stumbled back. "Wait! This is a mistake!" The officers grabbed his arms and started dragging him toward the exit. Blake's face twisted in rage as he twisted toward Jason. "You little brat!" Jason's eyes narrowed. "See you at the appeal." Blake's scream was cut off as the doors slammed shut behind him. The courtroom was deathly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Every eye was fixed on Jason. Jason turned toward Judge Harris. His chest was rising and falling quickly. His hands were shaking slightly at his sides. Judge Harris's gaze softened. "Mr. Carter?" He stood and walked down from the bench, stopping in front of Jason. He knelt slightly to meet Jason's eye level. "You just dismantled one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state," Judge Harris said quietly. "That was extraordinary." Jason's cheeks flushed pink. "Thank you, Your Honor." Judge Harris smiled. "You may have a future in this." Jason smiled faintly. "We'll see." Michael pulled Jason into a tight hug. Jason's arms wrapped around his father's waist, and for a moment Jason allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe. "You did it," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "Jason, you saved me." Jason's eyes stung. "I promised I would." Michael's hand brushed the back of Jason's hair. "You are incredible." Jason pulled back and wiped his eyes quickly. "It's not over yet." Judge Harris turned toward the jury. "Given the new evidence presented, I am dismissing the case against Mr. Carter. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel hitting the desk seemed louder than before. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled toward the exit, people shouting into their phones. Michael knelt in front of Jason, tears streaming down his face. "You were amazing." Jason's eyes were bright. "I told you I could do it." Michael cupped his son's face in his hands. "Jason, I am so proud of you." Jason's lips curved into a soft smile. From across the room, one of the jury members stood and started to clap, then another and another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding. Jason's eyes widened. He glanced toward his father, who smiled and nodded. Slowly, Jason straightened his back and smiled. He lifted his chin toward the crowd. Blake was gone. The charges were dropped. His father was free. Jason had won, and he had earned every second of it.